All right, stepsons, I had a request from Pedro in Brazil on how to barbecue steaks. So Pedro, I've got to tell you, I talked to my son Jacob, who cooks steaks more often than I do and better than I do. And he suggested pan frying was better than barbecue. For steaks, Jacob agreed to show you, Pedro, and everybody else how to cook steaks. So, where do we start, Jacob?
So, probably the first step that matters when you're cooking a steak is selecting the steak that you're going to cook. And so my personal favorite would be a New York strip, or a strip steak is what it's also called sometimes. But you can use the same steps that I'm going to tell you to pick a good steak with any cut. So when you're picking the steaks that you want, you're going to get a more tender, more flavorful steak as you get more intramuscular fat. So that is the fat that's inside the steak. You can see we have some around the outside here, but we also have these specks of fat throughout the steak itself. That's going to render out in the cooking process, and it's going to make the steak more tender and more flavorful. So that's what you're looking for when you're picking your steak.
Do we need to wash our hands first?
I already did.
Okay.
That is an important step. You should always wash your hands before and after working with raw meat. So once we have selected our steaks, then we have to choose how we're going to cook them. Today, my favorite method is cooking them in a good old cast iron pan, so that's what we're using.
So we got the meat, we got the pan,
yes,
we got all the seasonings.
It is hard to mess up a steak when you use some basic seasonings. Salt, pepper, and garlic powder, that's what we're using today. As you get more familiar with cooking steaks and you find different seasonings that you like, you should try different seasoning mixes. There are also options you can find at the grocery store for pre-made seasoning mixes.
So what's next?
So next, once we've picked out our seasonings, we've got the meat picked out, we've got the cooking method. We want to make sure we have everything prepped so that whatever we're cooking finishes at the same time. You like mushrooms on your steak.
I do.
I don't.
Mushrooms, sautéed mushrooms. So sautéing the mushrooms in butter, medium to low heat, and garlic. I'm going to use cloves of garlic and run them over the grinder a little bit. Take a big knife while it's on the counter, put the blade away from you, put it flat on there, and then smack it, and then peel it. All right, no vampires in our house tonight. Okay, now I'm peeling. All right, so now I'm going to take these and grate them into the pan. I've got the garlic semi-smashed. I'm just going to run it over the grater. You can see on the back side there's shredded pieces. I'm just going to push those in and do as much of this as I can. Now I've got my butter, my olive oil, and my shredded garlic. Now I will dump my pre-sliced mushroom slices into the pan. I'm going to use a wooden spoon, and once I've got it mixed around, I'm going to put the lid on it and let it simmer. It's a good idea to have a clean plate that you can set your utensils on while you're cooking.
The next step is going to be to season the steaks, but before we do that, I've already got the cast iron on the stove heating up a little bit. Not too much yet because we don't want it to be too hot before we're actually using it, but we want it to be hot when we do use it. Before I touch the raw meat, what I'm going to do is pour out a little bit of salt from the container into its own bowl so I don't have to touch the container while I got raw meat hands. And we are going to pat it dry from its juices. So we've got the steaks nice and patted dry. Then we're putting oil back on so that the seasonings stick. Just a little tiny bit. Okay, so then you just want to make sure the steaks get nice and covered in that oil. And you want to use a high temperature cooking oil, so something like avocado oil. We don't have that with us today, so we're just using some vegetable oil. We're going to take the salt, and you want to be fairly generous with the salt. You can use whatever type of salt you want. I just use kosher salt because it's easier to see how much I'm putting on the steaks. And you want to make sure that you season both sides as well as the edges of the steak. You can use fresh ground pepper. That is always going to be more flavorful than pre-ground pepper. And so that's what we're using. As you start to season the steaks, you notice how there's a lot of seasonings accumulating on the surface we're using. You can also just use those seasonings that are there near the steaks to help season the edges as well.
Okay, here's the garlic. Oh, is that too much?
No, that's just about right. That is a happy steak.
All right, Pedro, take good notes. Good?
Yep.
Okay.
These steaks are now seasoned and ready to go.
And in the meantime, I'm going to check and stir the sauteing mushrooms.
When I'm cooking a steak, I like to make sure it's going to be cooked to the doneness that I want, which for me, that's medium rare. I shoot for about 135 degrees Fahrenheit on the internal temperature. And I use a probe thermometer to ensure that I'm cooking it to that temperature. So we're just going to stick it into the thickest part of the steak, which is right about there. We want to make sure that when it goes in, it's nice and level so that the end of that probe ends up in the middle of that steak. And so now, as we're cooking it, we'll be able to make sure we're not going to overcook it. We're going to use some more of that vegetable oil to help cook the steak. So I'm going to add some of that to the pan. There's already a little in there, but we need a little more. So you can tell that the oil is warm enough when it kind of shimmers on top. And we're going to get the pan a little hotter. You want medium-high heat for this. You don't want to go too hot where we start to get smoking oil, because at that point the oil is not going to taste as good and it's going to transfer that bad flavor over to the steak. As that oil is warming up, I am prepping right over here with the steaks. So the steak is ready to go. You notice I've also got the actual thermometer portion, so we can connect that probe to it and get the temperature readout. And then I've also got butter. We're going to melt some butter into the pan with it, and we're going to baste it with that butter to keep it juicy as we're cooking. Now that we're kind of getting that shimmer on the oil, I'm going to transfer the steak to the pan. And then once it is in the pan, let it sit for 2 minutes. This is going to help develop a good crust on the steak, and it's going to give it a good brown sear. And brown on the steak is where the flavor comes from. So it's going to taste better as it gets more seared. So it's been about 2 minutes. Now we're going to flip it. When you flip the steak over, you want to flip it to a part of the pan that has not had the steak resting on it.
Ah, that's why you can't cook two at once.
Yep. 2 more minutes.
In the meantime, I've uncovered the mushrooms, stirred them around a few times, and they're looking pretty good.
Okay, so now it's been another 2 minutes. So what I'm going to do is add about 3 tablespoons of butter into the pan. And I'm going to start basting it like I mentioned. So just let that butter melt and spoon it up over the steak like this, right? And we'll do this for about 30 seconds. And then I'm going to flip it over. And so with that, I'm going to cut the heat. We will evacuate the steak over to this place that I prepared for it to rest. This is going to allow the steak to sort of like cool down a little bit so that when we cut it open, not all of the juices escape all at the beginning. We've cooked the first steak. We still have to cook our second steak, so we're going to remove the oil and butter that we used for the first one. With cast iron, the entire pan is going to heat up, so you got to be careful when you're moving it that you protect yourself from getting burned. And we don't want to put this down the drain because it's going to clog up the drain, so we're going to catch it, let it solidify, and then throw it out later. I am going to grab paper towel and get the little burned bits out as well. As long as you're quick about this, you're not going to get burned. All right, so now that we got the pan cleaned out, we're going to add some fresh oil in for the second steak and let that warm up. And this one, we're just going to cook it for the same amount of time since it's the same thickness. All right, so now the steaks have rested for about 5 minutes, about 10 minutes on that first one, 5 minutes on the second one. So we're gonna cut one open and see how we did on the cook. And so you can see right there, there's a little bit pink on the inside, a little bit more than medium rare that I was going for, but still a very well cooked steak. I'm happy with that. Let's see how they taste.
Oh, Pedro, you can't go wrong with this one. That was good. Thank you, Jacob.
Happy to. Always happy for an excuse to have some steak.
Oh, that was good. All right, now we need to get the mashed potatoes and the sautéed mushrooms. Oh, wow, that was good. All right, stepsons. Now you know how to cook steaks the way Jacob cooks them, and I'm telling you they are delicious. Pedro, I don't know if your uncles can do this well on a barbecue or not, but these taste delicious. Always remember, you guys, even though your dad may not be in your daily life, you can still learn stuff like this. You can succeed. And you do have a dad that loves you, because this dad loves you. And I'll see you on the next video.